Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Dialexicon podcast, a podcast targeted at the youth, where we critically engage in philosophy and correlate philosophy research to contemporary and social issues, all at an easy to understand and digestible level. My name is Saurish and I'm your host. This week, we're joined by Dr. Sam Clarke, who is currently a MindCORE Research Fellow at the University of Pennsylvania, and in the summer of 2023 will be an assistant professor of philosophy at the University of Southern California. Hi, Dr. Clarke. How are you today?
Yeah, I'm really good. Thanks for inviting me along. I think this will be fun.
Of course. And before we begin our discussion, which is on a really interesting topic about like the non-linguistic mind, I asked all my guests this question, and I wanted to ask you as well. How did you get into philosophy? What stood out to you?
Yeah, I think probably like a lot of people that end up in this weird profession, I had a fairly circuitous route to philosophy. So I think looking back, when I was a small child, I was pretty philosophically minded. So I guess through getting to know my partner, it's become apparent to me that where a lot of small children are really into stories, I feel like I was always really into kind of like Dorling Kindersley science books. Like I wanted to read the book about like the universe or, how the brain works, things like that, which I guess is pretty sciencey. And I think that's how I saw myself. But it would always lead me to kind of deep philosophical questions. Like I feel like I remember hearing about the Big Bang for the first time, and I was like, what happened before the Big Bang? Like, why is there something instead of nothing? And I guess when I was a kid as well, my parents got me this, I don't know if this toy still exists, but it was a super cool toy called Lego Mindstorms, and it was basically this robotics kit. You could use your Lego, there were some motors, some sensors, and this like really simple programming language for kids. And I was always like super ambitious with with the robots that I wanted to build with my Lego. Like I basically wanted to build like human level intelligence. But through thinking about this, I would always then get worried about like, oh wait, like the problem of consciousness, like how am I going to build that into my machine? And now I think about it, how do I know my parents are conscious? So I think I was always pretty philosophically minded. That being said, when I got to high school, I think it would be fair to say I stopped being a particularly committed student, which is not very admirable. Yeah, and I suppose like nowadays everyone's into rock climbing, but I was really, really into rock climbing when I was a teenager. And basically when I finished high school, I had no aspirations to go to university at all. I just wanted to go rock climbing, push that as hard as I could. I did after high school go climbing a lot. But after a few years, I ended up going to university, and because I didn't consider myself particularly academic, but I had this kind of outdoorsy interest, I ended up going to the University of Edinburgh to do this course called Community Education, which was in their teaching college. And it's a really cool course. Basically, half of the course, I was learning about things like social welfare, political ideology, and the other half of the course was basically training me to be an educator that could work with people who were maybe excluded from mainstream education. So I ended up working with this charity called Venture Scotland that basically take the people I was working with, predominantly drink and drug addicts, providing them with opportunities to do cool stuff in the outdoors. And I think, to everyone's surprise, including my own, I quickly realized that I didn't feel I was the right person for the kind of the practical side of this course. I found it really stressful, and I just didn't really feel like I had the right people skills or the right life experience to be helpful to these kids. But I really loved the academic side of the course. And so I initially swapped into politics and sociology because I liked these issues to do with political ideology and social welfare, things like that. And I just took philosophy as an outside class. I'm not even sure why I took philosophy. I can't really remember my thought process. But very quickly I realized that like I absolutely loved philosophy. These were all the questions that I'd been interested in for a long time. And yeah, the first year was a bit tough. I don't think I like took to it immediately, but I remember at the start of the second year, we did this course on philosophy of mind and philosophy of language, which I guess are issues that I'm still interested in now. And I just thought, this is awesome. This is what I want to do with my life. And yeah, here I am. So that's my life story.
That's an awesome story. Thanks for that. And honestly, like now, I guess since you've already introduced the research topics that you're into, we can maybe talk about a little bit more about those things. So our discussion today is on like the non-linguistic mind. And so to actually talk about that, we need to understand what that is. So what is the non-linguistic mind, and what are some questions that your research is focused on?
Yeah, so I mean, I think if I was being cynical, I would say that the non-linguistic mind is this kind of term which I've made up, or maybe other people have made up and I've just taken on. That's really just a way of kind of packaging my research. So, you know, there are some really nice things about being a philosopher. So one of the really awesome things about it is that you kind of just get to work on whatever you want. So you can just follow your nose and work on whatever issues you find most interesting. The flip side of this is that it's quite easy to end up working on a bunch of completely unrelated issues, and that's fine. But for better or worse, I guess employers want there to be some kind of bigger project in your work. They want it to be going in one direction. You're becoming the person on this thing. And so I guess when I hit the job market, I had to kind of think about how various disparate issues that I'd been interested in, I'd published some papers on, were actually related. And I guess through thinking about that, I realized, oh, there is actually this really overarching theme in my work, which is that I'm interested in non-linguistic mindedness. So I think for me, this breaks down into two projects. So on the one hand, I'm really interested in how the mind or the brain might encode information. So a really kind of orthodox standard view is that the mind represents things. So, you know, when I believe that John loves Mary, there's some state in my head, in my brain, that is representing this proposition that John loves Mary. It means that John loves Mary. And as a result, it has truth conditions. It could be false, it could be true, or accuracy conditions more generally. I suppose a really natural thought, which I'm broadly sympathetic to, it's definitely controversial, is that mental states like that, like my belief that John loves Mary, are going to be kind of sentence-like. They're going to be kind of like linguistic structures. So I have a concept of John, I have a concept of Mary, I have a concept of a loving relation. And in the same way that sentences seem to be built from the meanings of words plus the way in which they're combined, you might think something similar is going on with my belief when I believe this. These concepts just get combined in certain ways, and that determines what they mean. So they're a little bit like sentences, and this is a really kind of orthodox view. This is the sort of thing that you'll end up discussing. It's hugely controversial, but you end up discussing in a lot of kind of intro philosophy of mind, philosophy of psychology courses. But I guess during my PhD, it became clear to me that there were all these other bits of the mind that cognitive scientists wanted to describe as being kind of underpinned by non-linguistic representations. So perhaps most famously, some researchers argue that early vision and things like visual imagery are more like pictures. So I guess there was this project here trying to unpack the similarities and differences between these mental states and pictures. In what sense are they supposed to be picture-like? Is this just metaphorical? Is there some deeper truth to it? And in what way do those picture-like representations differ from the kind of sentence-like representations that philosophers have done a lot more work on? So that was kind of one aspect of my research. And then there's this second aspect of my research, which I guess for a long time I thought was completely disconnected, but increasingly I see connections between these two projects. And this was kind of a more scientific project. I mean, they're both very empirically driven. But here there's a kind of methodological issue, which is just that it seems like young human children who can't yet talk, lots and lots of animals have really sophisticated psychological capacities. But there's a kind of like puzzle about how we can actually know what they're thinking or what's going on in their head. You know, if I want to know what you're thinking, I might just ask you. If, you know, I want to check that you understand Pythagoras. I might give you a test where you have to answer various questions. And based on that, I can probe how deep your understanding is, what it is what you're thinking, maybe where you're going wrong, and so forth. But there's this puzzle, like, how are you going to do that with particularly very young human babies? I mean, they can't even point. They don't really have refined motor control. So there's just this sort of methodological puzzle. And I think I was lucky enough to have some really awesome lecturers like early on in my philosophical education. When I was an undergrad at Edinburgh, there's a lady, Susan Lavelle, who does really cool work on these kinds of issues. And then I went to do a master's at the University of Warwick, and there's a professor there who had a huge influence on me, Steve Butterfield. I think he's basically devoted his career to this kind of question. And so, yeah, so these are really two separate issues, but I do see them as kind of interrelated in sort of interesting ways.
Awesome, that makes sense. And I think like there's like more importance, I guess, in kind of combining like science almost with philosophy. I think like that's something that's really, really interesting. And philosophy of mind is something where like in cognitive science in general is something where kind of science meets philosophy really, really well. It's one of like the, I guess like maybe not few, but one of the fields where you can see it really easily how philosophy ingrains or like how they like kind of are complementary, right? Like science helps philosophy, philosophy helps science, so much. But I guess inside of like these overarching like non-linguistic traits or whatever of the mind, are they innate? So as in we're born with them. You mentioned like how babies don't have the ability to like obviously talk or like get tested on some things. So how do we necessarily know that they're born with it? Are they like evolutionary developed? If so, why would these traits be developed over a period of time through evolution?
Yeah, so I think there were several questions there maybe. So you started off by asking about whether these traits or psychological capacities are innate. And I think in some ways that's a difficult question, because in order to answer it, we need to know what we mean by innate. So I think that often when people dispute whether something's innate, what they have in mind is something like, was it present at birth? Was it just there when the baby popped out into the world? And I think on kind of reflection, this isn't a very good way of thinking about what's innate and what's not. The classic example might be something like, I innately grow teeth. This is something that I was always going to do if I had the right environmental conditions. But yeah, it depends on the right environmental conditions. And I didn't have teeth at birth. I relied on having parents that gave me the right nutrients and so forth. If that hadn't happened, I would never have grown teeth. But I think we still want to say that's innate, at least insofar as something's being innate is to be contrasted with it being learned. So I didn't learn to grow teeth. This is something that was kind of built into me. It was going to happen. And I guess sort of framed in that way, there's maybe no necessary connection between these non-linguistic psychological capacities and their being innate. So these, the first project that I was interested in, like how the brain or the mind might represent information, this like non-linguistic format, maybe more like a picture or more like a mercury thermometer. Maybe there's not any reason why the kinds of psychological processes that those mental states underpin couldn't be learned. And similarly, I think once you move away from this claim about, or this idea that nativism is tied to things being present at birth, there's not any necessary reason. Well, sorry, let me flip that around. I think, there's kind of, there's a more obvious connection between the question of like whether very, very young human children have certain psychological abilities and whether those psychological abilities are innate. But, they could still be learned, right? Children don't acquire language for a reasonable amount of time. There's potentially lots of opportunity for them to acquire these psychological capacities through learning, without them being innate. That being said, I don't want to make a kind of blanket claim. I think there's just lots and lots of aspects to the mind, and it's hugely complicated, and I'm not qualified to comment on 99% of them. But the psychological capacities that I've found myself interested in and working on, I think, often are innate in some really significant sense. Yeah. So I guess we're going to talk about the psychological capacities themselves. So maybe I won't jump the gun there.
Yeah, so I guess maybe we can go into like your paper, which is on like the number sense, which represents I guess in print like rational numbers. So what exactly is number sense, and then why do you believe it only represents rational numbers as opposed to irrational numbers? And then also maybe like why would this be a non-linguistic trait?
Yeah. Okay. Good. So yeah. So the number sense is supposed to be this psychological system which enables us to represent the approximate number of items in an observed collection. So I think that we're really familiar with thinking of maths as this hugely sophisticated, abstract form of cognition, maybe primarily for really smart people, but certainly something that's the result of kind of enculturation. We need to go through maths class, we need to be taught to count. These are these really abstract things. But it turns out there's a lot of evidence that really, really young human infants and many, many non-human animals have this kind of basic sense of number prior to any kind of mathematical education. So these mathematical abilities aren't perfect. Nobody's denying that they're very, very different from the kind of mature grasp of number that you'll acquire if you go through a formal maths education. But they do, at least on my account, and I think on the kind of orthodox view, genuinely concern numbers, these really abstract things. So numbers of the same sort that we might discuss in the maths class. The key difference is that they're very, very imprecise, and they seem to be much more tied to perception. So to give you a kind of intuitive example, if I was to present, 50 dots over here, and 20 dots over here, and I present it very, very quickly, you'd probably be able to tell just by looking in an instant that one collection contained a larger number of dots. And the really interesting thing is that scientists have spent a lot of time trying to rule out simpler explanations. So, that kind of crude example, you might worry, oh, maybe this isn't because there's a larger number of dots over here. Maybe it's because there's a greater total surface area of dots over here, or the perimeter of all the dots is larger in total than over here. Maybe the total collection is brighter than the total collection over here. Scientists, have run many, many very carefully controlled studies that I think undermine all of these explanations and provide us with really powerful evidence that these abilities really concern number. And the really striking thing is that you find them, slightly repeating myself, but you find them in very, very young human children and non-human animals. So to give a very, very famous example, these really incredible developmental psychologists, Fei Xu and Elizabeth Spelke, have this really seminal paper from 2000 where they basically presented 6-month-olds with collections of dots. And one of the things that's tricky about studying kids is obviously, they're kind of idiots. So they can't do very much. They're, they burst into tears, they fall asleep and so forth. They can't kind of answer questions and so forth. But one thing which they can do is they can look at things. And their looking behavior is often very revealing. So in this study, what Xu and Spelke did was they basically presented half of the kids with collections of 8 dots. So imagine you're the child, I keep presenting you with a picture that contains 8 dots, the size of the dots changes, the brightness of the dots changes, and so forth. All these other properties seem to change, but the number stays the same. And I just keep presenting that until basically you get bored. Now I'm going to present another slide But here it's going to change in number. So you've got bored of kind of seeing 8 dots. You're like, yeah, got it. I don't care about that anymore. But now I present you with a slide that has 16 dots. What they found was that these 6-month-old infants would suddenly regain interest. They were like, whoa, something's different here. And like I say, they tried to rule out these simpler explanations where, you know, the children were just relying on the total surface area of the dots, the brightness of the dots, what's called the convex hull of the dots. So like basically the smallest perimeter you could draw around the whole collection of dots and so forth. And this motivated the suggestion that the children really were, you know, their attention was being piqued by a change in number, was the conclusion that they came to. So through these looking time paradigms and kind of carefully ruling out simpler explanations, they purported to find evidence that at least in 6-month-olds, you got very similar psychological capacities to those found in adult humans when, for instance, you discriminate the number of dots over here and the number of dots over here very quickly.
So I guess as like a follow-up question to that phenomenon, so is this based off of like perception? Is that like these babies are perceiving numbers? Because from my understanding, like numbers are just abstract signs that are attached to the signifier. So like in that sense, are they really perceiving the number, or are they just perceiving the fact that like there is a difference in the stimuli, in the sense that, like, as you mentioned, it could be brighter, it could be like just a massive, I guess, more amount, which would be related to like size or some capacity or something like that. So maybe there's like alternate reasons. So why is this like tied to maybe like a theory of number sense as opposed to just a theory of vision or something else?
Yeah. So so one thing to say is, and I think this is a kind of background issue that I think makes this work on the number sense, or it's more commonly, I guess, referred to as the approximate number system. It can make it seem a little bit kooky and a little bit weird, is that a lot of people seem to be disposed to thinking of numbers as symbols in some ways. So, and I think this is just obviously a mistake. So in the same way that, you know, the color red isn't the same thing as the word red written on a bit of paper, the number 7 isn't the same as any kind of abstract symbol for 7, you know, the Arabic numeral 7 or anything like that. And so, yeah, when I claim that, you know, these 6-month-olds were representing number, or really I just follow Fei Xu and Elizabeth Spelke in claiming this, I'm not suggesting that children are perceiving and recognizing symbols for numbers. And I'm certainly not suggesting that when they see the collection of dots, you know, some symbol 7 pops up in their visual field or anything like that. The way that I think this works is it's just a little bit more like how we perceive other magnitudes. So, you know, I could present you with 2 bottles that differ in volume, and this might be able to be something that you can tell just by looking. So if one of them was larger in volume, you know, there might be certain illusions, but all else being equal, you know, changes in the volume of the bottle will cause changes in just how it looks. And I think that's the right way to think about these numerical abilities. It's changes, your visual system is sensitive to changes in number, and through representing the numerical quantity in addition to the size, the shape, the color, and so forth of the dots, it alters your percept of the collection. So I guess framed in this way, I don't actually think it's as weird as people initially think it is to suppose that we might perceive numbers in some real sense. I mean, we're quite familiar with the idea that we perceive a lot of very abstract things, like we perceive triangles, but nobody thinks that, we perceive triangularity completely in abstraction from the triangular things that we're looking at. I guess I think here it's like, yeah, you need to see some dots, but then this attribute of being around about 7 in number is going to alter the perceptual experience of the dots in interesting ways. Does Does that help? Does that get at your question?
Yeah, definitely. And then I guess also just because like we're going off of this sense of like, obviously if you're seeing something and you recognize that it's also close to seven or some number, I guess like how would this differ for individuals with like different vision disabilities where they're not able to see different things? Does that kind of translate to less of an ability to number sense or like accurately number sense? And then also just because I'm using it in this way, does number sense have like a spectrum of like good number sense or like bad number sense, like in terms of your own cognitive ability to do that?
Yeah, so there's certainly a lot of work showing that you can train your number sense, so you can improve the acuity of your number sense. So one thing which I guess I didn't maybe make completely explicit is that unlike our kind of mature conceptual grasp of number that most of us have, that we employ when we're in the maths class, and we think about 7 as categorically different from 8 or even 7.1, these numerical abilities seem to conform to what's called Weber's law. So in kind of layman's terms, basically what this means is that the reliability with which we'll discriminate two numbers in this kind of perceptual way using our number sense is predicted by the ratio between them rather than the absolute difference. So if you imagine, if one collection has twice as many dots as the other, that's going to be a lot easier to distinguish. It's going to be a lot easier to say which collection has more than if, one of them has 30 dots and the other one has 31. And this is going to show up in the number of errors people make, how confident they are in their answers, and so forth. So why was I talking about this? What was the question?
Yeah, so kind of the relationship between vision and number sense,
Yeah.
and then also I guess maybe it's just like because I was thinking about it too. Does number sense necessarily need to be in vision? Because like when you're thinking about like let's say if we're talking about like the economy or something, you're like something is about to go like 1.5 times higher or something like that. Is that also number sense, or is that just like estimation and stuff?
Well, yeah. So I remember why I was talking about this originally. It was basically, people, you can measure how good people's Weber fraction is. So if you think you have this kind of ratio sensitivity, the closer things get to 1-to-1, the harder they get to discriminate with your number sense. People vary in how good they are at discriminating numerical quantities in this way. And you can, it seems like you can train it. That being said, back to your original question of how this might relate to various learning difficulties, mathematical learning difficulties, it's tricky. I don't have a strong view on this. There's certainly a bunch of evidence that has reported connections between variation in visual number sense or acuity of people's visual number sense and various mathematical learning difficulties, suggesting that there's a really important link there. But I think it would be fair to say that the evidence is mixed, and it's really, really controversial exactly how these pre-linguistic numerical abilities even relate to our mature grasp of number. So, even putting aside learning difficulties, it's very, very controversial how our number sense, or if our number sense even is the kind of basis for our mature grasp of number. So I think one possibility that we have to take very seriously is that these just work very, very independently. It's a bit like how, you can learn all kinds of things about geometry and think about them very precisely, but maybe your visual system was already processing some related things all through the lifespan. And these kind of things, they just kind of keep working independently once you've acquired a kind of mature grasp of geometry through the rest of your life. I mean, I think for the most part, that's how these things are working. So adults have a number sense, even when they've learned to think about numbers precisely, they can still rely on these more perceptual capacities. And yeah, there's this really difficult question about how we acquire that mature grasp of number in the first place. And there's massive disagreement there. So way back when, people like Randy Gallistel and Rochelle Gelman argued that basically you learn the precise numbers by just mapping number words onto the representations of your number sense. That has been criticized quite heavily, most notably by Susan Carey, and more recently by Susan Carey and David Barner. Yeah, I think it's really difficult. There's just a lot of mixed evidence there, and I'm not really an expert on this issue. I guess what I hope that I can bring to these kinds of debates is a clearer understanding of exactly what the number sense is doing, how it works, such that maybe it becomes clearer how these gaps, or what the gap is that needs to be bridged. What is the difference between our kind of pre-linguistic number sense that's just present throughout the lifespan and this kind of mature enculturated grasp of number that most adult humans come to acquire? How do those things relate? I think it's going to be very difficult to answer that question without understanding what both of those psychological capacities ultimately involve. And I think that's the kind of first step that maybe I'm more heavily involved in.
Right, yeah, that makes sense. And I guess since we're also talking about, I mean, maybe like we weren't able to explain how it can, like what like these learning disabilities might mean, but maybe in the sense of like just acquiring information or acquiring knowledge, or learning in general, how does culture come into play here? I feel like there could be ways in which like different cultural like differences in numbers, how they're represented and how that could be processed in the mind. So is there like these differences, and how does culture influence number sense in general?
Yeah, so I think that a very standard view, which I'm not necessarily endorsing, but one which you could find in textbooks or kind of introductory articles on the number sense, is that, and I think this feeds into earlier questions about whether or not the number sense is innate, whether these numerical abilities or pre-linguistic abilities more generally are innate. Is this idea that actually the number sense is just found, not only is it found in many, many different creatures, not just humans, but also, rats, pigeons, monkeys, and so forth. It's also found in humans quite generally, irrespective of their culture, their learning environment, and so forth. While the kind of mature conceptual grasp of number that we acquire seems to be much more dependent on culture. And in particular, I think kind of surprisingly, the standard view has been that it's really dependent on you growing up in an environment where you're exposed to number terms. So you need to grow up speaking a language that actually has words for precise numbers. And some of the evidence that was supposed to speak to this was work done by Pika and colleagues, led by a very famous neuroscientist, Stanislaw Dehaene. And they basically went into the Amazon basin and worked with this tribe, the Minduku, who basically don't seem to have precise words for numbers greater than 5. And basically what they found was when they tested them on all the standard number sense kind of tests that have been run many, many times in, I guess, rich children and rich adults in the Boston area or wherever most of these studies have been done, they basically replicated them. So despite not having a language that had precise number terms for numbers larger than 5, the Minduku seem to basically have a number sense that works much the same way that any of kind of richer industrialized populations that had been tested did. Where they found a difference was when it came to trying to get people in the Minduku to conceptualize precise numbers. So they would, they ran a bunch of tests that were supposed to show that the Minduku really couldn't or really were very averse to recognizing, say, 15 is categorically different from 16, things like that. These numbers that are outside of their count range. I think that works maybe a little bit more dubious. I think there are lots of things which could be going on that would have prevented success in these tasks. There's a very famous distinction from Chomsky, performance and competence. You got to be careful when somebody fails to perform a task in a certain way. You got to be very careful moving from that to the idea that they lack the competence, the psychological competence to do that. And there might be all kinds of motivational issues and so forth. I also think, and this is super controversial, you're not going to find this in any textbooks. I think there's also just more evidence that the kind of innate basis for mature numerical understanding is much richer than people actually appreciate. So a bunch of work in psycholinguistics seems to find that children use very, very sophisticated and precise representations of number when they're adjudicating, when they're trying to learn, for instance, a linguistic rule, a grammatical rule. So they're very, very attentive to the number of times that the rule gets stuck to and the number of times that it gets violated when they're deciding whether or not to kind of embrace the rule or just learn things on a case-by-case basis. And I think that's kind of harder to explain without thinking that children have a much richer grasp of number prior to education than is standardly thought. But yeah, I've not written a paper on that. That's super controversial. I don't think you'll find very many proponents of that view in the literature. And so, yeah, so a standard view has been that even if you don't fully buy those studies with the Munduku, a standard view has been that our kind of mature grasp of number is definitely shaped by culture in really quite important ways, but our number sense isn't. It's kind of there whether you want it or not.
That's really interesting. I mean, that means that there's maybe like even, I guess, in evolution, there's that would probably hint towards how evolution plays a role in number sense, but like specifically like the environment. And I guess there's like the nature versus nurture debate here as well, but like how environment and like your culture, et cetera, and society in general shapes the way in which you think about numbers going forward, but your general sense of understanding like number sense and like estimating, I guess, like how like different types of numbers remains the same. Or
so maybe one thing I'd just add, just in the background to all these issues that we're kind of coming back to about nativism, I mentioned that study before by Fei Xu and Elizabeth Spelke with 6-month-olds, where it seemed like they would regain attention when they were presented with twice as many dots or half as many dots. But back to this ratio sensitivity, they wouldn't kind of regain attention or interest so readily when the ratio between the number of dots was closer to 1-to-1. One thing which I would just add is 6-month-olds, 6 months is quite a long time. Children are these little learning machines, so that's quite a lot of time to learn a bunch of stuff. One of the more striking results, it's really crazy, was another study that Liz Spelke was involved in, but led by Veronica Izard in Paris. And basically they tested newborn infants on these kinds of abilities, on these kinds of tasks. And not only did the children perform significantly above chance, they seemed to be able to recognize matches in number this time rather than changes in number. They could even do this cross-modally. So they seem to be able to match a number of heard tones to a number of seen flashes. And I think what's really interesting about this, or sorry, not seen flashes, seen collections of dots. And I think what's really interesting about this is that if you think about the similarities and differences between hearing a sequence of tones and seeing a collection of dots on the screen, it's really hard to see what simpler explanation they could be. If it was a kind of visual to visual comparison task, you might think, well, maybe, you know, it's the total surface area of the dots, or maybe it's the total brightness of the display, and so forth. But the point to note is that heard tones don't have any of these properties. They don't have a total surface area or a brightness. And conversely, you know, the tones have properties like loudness and pitch, but the dots on the screen don't have any of these properties. So I think these cross-modal studies and the fact that you find them in newborn infants, so all of these children were under 5 days old, and actually you found it in 15 of the 16 children tested. So to be clear, they did have to, throw the results out from a bunch of kids because newborn babies are nightmares, right? They like burst into tears and they fall asleep mid-experiment and things like that. And so if they do that, you just have to kind of eliminate them from the children whose data you're analyzing. But I think it's pretty striking that 15 of the 16 children tested, all under 5 days old, were responding in ways that suggested that they had a number sense already online. And yeah, and then there's all these other animals. So a standard view has been this is kind of evolutionarily ancient. Although I think now we're just finding the number sense in so many creatures that I think we need to take seriously the idea that it's not really so much that it's evolutionarily ancient as much as just that it's hugely helpful to a lot of creatures. And so you get what's called convergent evolution. This psychological capacity just evolves in much the same way in many, many creatures because it's very efficient and very, very helpful for the creatures. And it's not kind of traced back to some common ancestor, which would now need to be so astronomically far in the past that it's starting to look less and less plausible. That's really the explanation for why all these creatures have a number sense. But yeah, very widespread in nature.
That is really interesting. I think like the newborn studies like really grounds the fact that there is number sense in general, and also kind of eliminates a lot of the maybe feedback or like negative, I guess, or not negative, but like kind of criticisms that you might receive for a study like that because it's cross-modal.
Yeah.
And I guess like this provides.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I mean, to be fair to my, not just my critics, but critics of this kind of orthodox view, there is a lot of concern about studying really young infants. So like I say, they fall asleep, they burst into tears, the data is quite noisy, and there have been failed replications. It's not always clear what a failed replication means. Does that mean that the original finding was wrong or didn't really exist? Or but yeah, I think that, like I say, the fact that this was found in 15 of the 16 newborn babies tested is really quite suggestive. And so while some people have criticized this and pointed to the fact that there have been problems with these kind of newborn studies in the past, I think that this kind of evidence, I think if you're not kind of, if you don't kind of have a background resistance to the existence of a number sense is really quite suggestive.
Yeah, I mean, I think it also just in general, even, if there is valid criticism, I think in general, there's a lot to discover about the mind through these discoveries or like experiments in general. And I guess like, because, there's a lot of research going on in this, I guess it's a valid question to ask, what are you doing now? What is your research focused on now? And like, are there any other projects that you're taking up? Could you describe a little bit more about them?
Yeah, so yeah, I'm working on a lot of things at the moment. So one of the things that's really cool about my job here at the University of Pennsylvania is that they have this thing, MindCORE, which is kind of like this interdisciplinary cognitive science thing. I'm not entirely sure what it is. It's not quite a department. It's not, but basically it brings together researchers from across different fields. And yeah, through that I've been doing, a bunch of work, primarily with this psychologist, Elizabeth Brannon. She's amazing. She's done a lot of the kind of groundbreaking research on the number sense, particularly in non-human animals, but also work on how this might relate to our kind of mature grasp of number. And so we've been running a bunch of experiments. So I feel actually you brought this up at some point, and this was just one of the questions I didn't answer. So you asked me about rational numbers. I've got this idea that where a lot of traditional work on the number sense has really just concerned whole or natural numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I think we've got some suggestive evidence that this number sense, this innate number sense, enables creatures to also represent things like ratios or fractions. And so we've been running a bunch of experiments that kind of test some of the claims that I made in print in this paper with Jake Beck. And yeah, obviously I'm hugely biased, but I think we're finding results that really vindicate a lot of the things that we suggested. So that's one project. Another project which I've been working on, which is experimental, again with Liz Brannon, but also with this guy, Sami Yusuf, who's amazing. We've been maybe questioning some of the evidence for thinking that the number sense really is perceptual. So I know that sounds like it's in tension with some of the things that I said earlier, but here there's a kind of background philosophical question about what distinguishes perception from cognition. And I think that really these numerical abilities, they're perception-like in some ways and not perception-like in others. And this is something that, again, we're running some experiments on, where these kind of fly in the face of sort of standard claims in the field. So yes, I'm doing a bunch of experimental work, but I'm a philosopher. I'm still writing a bunch of papers, and kind of linking the two projects that I talked about at the start, this question of non-linguistic formats, things like picture-like representations in the head, with these issues to do with psychological abilities that emerge independently of language. I've been writing a paper basically on the format of numerical representations, or using numerical representations as a nice case study to understand non-linguistic forms of mentality more generally. So hopefully that'll be coming out pretty soon. And yeah, so maybe that's where I see there's this deeper link between those two projects that initially seemed to me to just be like kind of two different things I was interested in. They seem much more closely related. I feel like there's probably lots of other things, but yeah, I'm running experiments, I'm writing philosophy papers, and yeah, it's pretty great. It's good. So
that's awesome. That sounds like a lot of fun, honestly. And I guess I just want to say thank you so much for your time and for being here today, because I learned a lot, and I think there's a lot of things that I want to actually like explore a little bit more. I feel like this number sense idea is really interesting, and I wanted to also read some of the criticism, because I feel like maybe this episode has already biased me a little bit, but I feel like there's importance in recognizing numerous views and viewpoints here. But I'll check those out. But then also I'll leave a link to your website in the description. So if anyone else wants to check those out, or at least some of the papers and research, you can check that out. But yeah, thanks so much, Dr. Clarke, for your time today. I learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience did as well.
Oh yeah, thanks so much. I had fun. It was good.